On the night of April 7, 2026, a Russian Geran-2 attack drone flew over Ukraine's Chernihiv region. What made this drone different from the thousands that have struck Ukraine since the invasion began was not its target, not its flight path, and not its explosive effect. It was what happened when Ukraine's security service, the SBU, examined the wreckage of the unexploded R-60 air-to-air missile that had been mounted on the drone. Their instruments detected elevated radiation. Laboratory analysis confirmed what the radiation readings suggested. The warhead contained depleted uranium. Specifically, it contained isotopes uranium-235 and uranium-238, incorporated into the penetrating elements of the missile as a density-enhancing material chosen historically for its ability to pierce hardened targets. 6 weeks later, on May 20, 2026, the SBU publicly disclosed what it had found. That same day, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said that if Russia uses nuclear weapons against Ukraine, the reaction from NATO will be devastating. And Zelenskyy, who had been briefed on the SBU's findings, called it exactly what it was: a war crime, an escalation, and a demonstration of Russian disregard for international law that the Western alliance must take seriously. Tonight we examine what Russia's use of depleted uranium in missile warheads actually means, militarily, medically, legally, and strategically. We examine why Russia made this specific choice, what it tells us about Russia's operational priorities, and its willingness to escalate the lethality and contamination risks of its weapons. We examine why NATO's warning matters, and why Zelenskyy's agreement with that warning is a deliberate diplomatic signal. And we examine why this development, which has received less international attention than the Moscow drone strikes or the territorial numbers, may in fact be one of the most consequential escalations of this entire war. Because what Russia has done with depleted uranium is not just a weapons technology decision. It is a message about where Russia is willing to go. Let us start with what depleted uranium is and why Russia incorporated it into missile warheads. Depleted uranium is a byproduct of uranium enrichment, the material left over after the fissile uranium-235 has been extracted for nuclear fuel or weapons. Despite being called depleted, it retains significant radioactivity and is extremely dense, approximately 1.7 times denser than lead. This density makes it extraordinarily effective as a penetrating material in weapons designed to pierce hardened targets. A rod or projectile made from depleted uranium retains kinetic energy at impact that conventional steel or even tungsten cannot match at the same weight. Depleted uranium penetrators have been used in anti-armor ammunition by the United States and the United Kingdom for decades. They were used by American forces in the Gulf War and in Iraq. The controversy around depleted uranium weapons centers on what happens after impact. When a depleted uranium penetrator strikes a hard surface, it partially aerosolizes, creating fine particles of radioactive dust that can be inhaled by anyone in the vicinity. The health effects of this dust, whether it causes elevated cancer rates, kidney damage, or other long-term health consequences, have been extensively studied and remain genuinely disputed in the scientific literature. What is not disputed is the radioactivity. Radiation levels of 12 microsieverts per hour were detected at the Chernihiv site where the R-60 missile wreckage was found, well above normal background levels. Russia's specific use in this case was different from conventional anti-armor applications. The R-60 is a Soviet-era air-to-air missile originally designed to shoot down aircraft. Russia has been mounting these missiles on modified Geran-2 drones, the same Iranian-designed Shahed drone that has been Russia's primary long-range attack weapon throughout this war, specifically to target Ukrainian aircraft and helicopters that are conducting air defense missions. When a Ukrainian fighter jet or helicopter intercepts a Russian drone swarm and attempts to shoot down the drones before they reach their targets, the Geran-2 drones carrying R-60 missiles can target those intercepting aircraft with the air-to-air missiles. The addition of depleted uranium to these warheads enhances their penetration capability against the airframes of Ukrainian aircraft. It also creates a contamination risk at any site where these weapons detonate or crash, including populated areas across Ukraine's north and east, where Ukrainian aircraft are conducting interception missions. Ukraine's Defense Intelligence, the HUR, had identified this configuration as early as December 2025, when it published the structure and supply chain of Geran-2 drones equipped with R-60 missiles. On January 12, 2026, HUR reported a Geran-2 modification carrying both a warhead and a Verba man-portable air defense missile. What was new in May 2026 was the forensic laboratory confirmation of depleted uranium in the warhead, the formal criminal designation under Article 438 of Ukraine's Criminal Code, the War Crimes provision, and the public disclosure designed to put the international community on notice. The SBU's public warning to Ukrainian citizens to exercise extreme caution when encountering debris from drones, missiles, or other munitions, because damaged or burned munitions may release radioactive dust hazardous to people and the environment, is not an abstract legal notice. It is a practical public health warning for a population that has spent 4 years living among weapons debris and has developed a kind of necessary casualness about the presence of military ordnance in their daily environment. That casualness, the SBU is now warning, carries a radiation risk that it did not previously carry. Now let us examine what NATO's response means and why Zelensky's agreement with it is deliberate. NATO Secretary General Rutte's statement on May 20th, that if Russia uses nuclear weapons against Ukraine, the reaction from NATO will be devastating, was made explicitly in response to the depleted uranium finding. This is significant because it represents NATO's decision to treat the confirmed presence of radioactive depleted uranium in Russian weapons as a category of escalation requiring a categorical response. The legal status of depleted uranium weapons under international humanitarian law is contested. The United States and the United Kingdom, which have used depleted uranium munitions themselves, argue that they are not prohibited under existing international law, that their military utility is legitimate, and that their health effects, while real, do not cross the threshold of weapons causing disproportionate civilian harm. Russia has used this contested legal status to argue that Western supply of depleted uranium ammunition to Ukraine, which occurred in 2023, sets a precedent that Russia is now following. Zelensky rejected this equivalence immediately and clearly. There is a critical difference between supplying depleted uranium ammunition for use in tank rounds against armored military vehicles, the use for which the United States and United Kingdom provided these munitions to Ukraine, and incorporating depleted uranium into missile warheads mounted on drones that are deliberately flown over populated areas. The former is a military application with contested but legally tolerated status in international law. The latter creates contamination risks for civilian populations in areas where the drones crash or are shot down. Zelensky said NATO's warning was exactly right. And by saying so publicly, he is doing two things simultaneously. He is aligning Ukraine with NATO's deterrent posture, signaling to Russia that Ukraine and its allies are treating this escalation as serious and will respond accordingly. And he is creating a public record of NATO's commitment to a devastating response, making it politically costly for NATO governments to retreat from that commitment if Russia continues or expands its use of radioactive materials in weapons targeting Ukrainian territory. This is sophisticated diplomatic judo. Zelensky cannot compel NATO to respond in any specific way to Russia's use of depleted uranium. But by publicly agreeing with NATO's statement, by formally endorsing it and incorporating it into his own public communications, he creates political accountability for the governments that made it. They have said devastating. He has agreed. Walking back from devastating now becomes visible, costly, and politically embarrassing for the alliance leadership that made the original commitment. Russia's use of depleted uranium in these warheads is not a nuclear escalation in the traditional sense. It is not the use of a nuclear weapon. It is not a tactical nuclear detonation, but it is a deliberate introduction of radioactive material into weapons used against Ukraine's military and, through the contamination risk, against Ukraine's civilian population. It is Russia signaling, through a weapons technology choice rather than a diplomatic statement, that there is no floor to the escalation it is willing to consider. That the instruments of nuclear contamination, even in their most attenuated form, are available to be used. That the international community's response to each previous escalation, the full-scale invasion, the strikes on civilian infrastructure, the missile attacks on hospitals and schools, the forced deportation of Ukrainian children, the mobilization of 9,000 drones per month, has not been sufficient to create a threshold Russia is unwilling to cross. NATO called it devastating. Zelensky agreed. And Russia has not issued any statement about the depleted uranium finding. The silence is itself a statement. An entity with a legitimate counter-argument to the SBU's findings would make that argument. Russia's silence suggests either that the findings are accurate and Russia cannot plausibly deny them, or that Russia has decided that the escalation is acceptable and denial is unnecessary. Neither interpretation is reassuring. Russia used depleted uranium in its missiles. NATO called the consequences devastating. Zelensky agreed. The question now is what devastating actually means, and whether the governments that use that word are prepared to make it mean something. Let us also consider the legal dimension of Russia's depleted uranium use. Because Ukraine's decision to open a formal war crimes investigation under Article 438 of its criminal code is not a symbolic gesture. It is the beginning of a legal process that will eventually reach international courts, and that Zelensky is specifically building the evidentiary record for. The International Criminal Court has already issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin in connection with the forced deportation of Ukrainian children. Ukraine has been systematically documenting Russian war crimes since the first days of the invasion. The Bucha massacres, the strikes on hospitals and schools, the torture of prisoners, and now the use of radioactive materials in weapons deployed over populated areas. The depleted uranium warhead found in Chernihiv in April 2026, forensically analyzed and formally documented by the SBU, is a piece of evidence in an international legal record that is being built with the same methodical care that Ukraine has applied to every other category of Russian war crime. The formal criminal designation under Article 438, the laboratory analysis confirming uranium-235 and uranium-238, the documentation of the 12 microsievert per hour radiation reading, far above background levels, at the crash site. The chain of custody from the crash site to the radioactive waste storage facility. All of it is evidentiary. Zelensky is building a legal case alongside a military campaign and a diplomatic strategy. These three tracks are not separate, they are integrated. The legal documentation of war crimes serves the diplomatic purpose of demonstrating to Western governments and international institutions that Russia's conduct in this war disqualifies it from the kind of easy sanctions relief and diplomatic normalization that a peace performance alone might generate. NATO called Russia's use of radioactive materials in weapons devastating if escalated to full nuclear use. Zelensky agreed. Ukraine opened a war crimes investigation. The SBU issued a public health warning to Ukrainian citizens. The evidence was logged and preserved. Russia said nothing. The silence continues. But the legal record accumulates. The evidence is documented. The international accountability process, however slow, moves forward. Russia used depleted uranium in its missiles. NATO called it devastating. Zelensky agreed and opened a war crimes investigation. The world is watching what comes next.